I remember that moment with frightening clarity, how I stood there in Mr. Peterson's office, with a strained smile on my face, while my parents hurriedly packed their things, not even bothering to finish the conversation with the teacher, who had just, with genuine enthusiasm, told them what their eldest daughter's future might be. He was still trying to say something, to somehow bring their attention back to me, but it was too late. My mother covered the phone with her palm, nodded in his direction with a polite, "Sorry, we have an emergency here," and they literally disappeared out the door, leaving me alone, blushing with shame and anger, in front of a confused Mr. Peterson, who probably saw for the first time how someone was so easily and unconditionally put in second place. I left school, feeling the ragged edges of the trophy under my fingernails, which I never showed my parents, and went home, realizing that no one would be there. They, of course, left to deal with Sarah. There was absolute silence in the dark hallway, and I held my breath, listening, suddenly hoping that at least one of them was still here, that Mom had left a note, that Dad had forgotten the keys and would be back soon. But nothing. Only the flickering light of the street lamp slid across the walls, and the smell of last night's dinner, which was already losing its appeal. I was 17. 17 years of living in this house, where everything revolved around one person. Where I didn't even have to hope that my achievements meant anything more than an insignificant background against the background of Sarah's eternal fragility. I didn't know what to do with this feeling, a mixture of pain, anger, and frustration, but I knew one thing. I could no longer just stand by and watch my life pass by, because someone else needed attention more than me. The next day, I made a decision. I gathered my documents, carefully filled out all the papers for applying for a scholarship and sent them without saying a word to my parents. They didn't even notice Sarah had just been given a new puppy in those days, and Mom was too busy choosing hypoallergenic food and sterile toys to ask what I was doing. It took several months before they found out. It was in the evening. I returned home late after classes, and as soon as I crossed the threshold, I immediately felt tension in the air. My mother was sitting at the table with her arms folded, my father was standing next to her, frowning, and in front of them lay a letter from the university where I was accepted. "What does that mean, Ruby?" Mom's voice was quiet, but there was barely contained anxiety in it. "It means I'm leaving," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm, but everything inside me was boiling. I was accepted. For a scholarship. I'm leaving in the fall. There was silence for a moment. Then Mom slowly shook her head. "But, Ruby." "Sarah's fine," I interrupted her, feeling a lump of anger rise in my throat. "It's been a long time. And I'm tired of waiting for you to notice it." I typed in my resignation letter, but before I hit send, I froze, staring at the screen, realizing that I was facing a life-changing choice to stay in the safe harbor of a stable but mediocre existence or step into the unknown, relying entirely on my own knowledge, intuition, and determination. My heart was pounding in my chest, my fingers were trembling over the keyboard, thousands of thoughts flashed through my head about how much effort I had put into my education, how I was afraid of not meeting expectations, how I had dreamed for years of finally taking control of my life, and now this moment had come. I took a deep breath, reread the text one more time, checked the wording, as if the future depended on the accuracy of the words, and finally clicked send. At the same moment, fear and relief flooded through me at the same time, as if I had jumped into the water from a high cliff, not knowing how deep I was, but feeling ecstatic at the very boldness of this step. I looked at the screen, saw an automatic reply from the HR department confirming receipt of the letter, and without giving myself time to doubt, I got up from my desk, folded my arms across my chest and slowly looked around the office, which has been a part of my life for so long. I saw these rows of desks, the dim light of the lamps, colleagues concentrating on their monitors. I heard the measured clicking of keyboards and the barely perceptible hum of conversations on the phone, and suddenly it all seemed so alien, so far away from me. Just yesterday, I thought that this place defined me, that my position was my identity, but now that I knew that in 2 weeks I would no longer be here, I felt only one thing: freedom. That evening, I walked home, enjoying the cool air, clutching my phone in my pocket, which was no longer tied to work emails and urgent calls, and for the first time in many years, I realized that I no longer needed to adjust to other people's expectations. I chose my own path. The next day, I woke up with an unusual feeling, a mixture of excitement and anxiety, but instead of panicking, I opened my laptop and began to make a clear plan. Now my finances were in my hands, and I couldn't afford to make a mistake. I reviewed my portfolio, calculated the possible risks, drew up a strategy for the next 6 months, and set a goal for myself to reach a new level of income so that I would never depend on an employer again. A few weeks have passed, and I've been diving deeper into the world of investing, analyzing trends, reviewing company reports, and evaluating the prospects for new startups. I spent a lot of time working on charts, reading articles, and chatting on forums, and for the first time in many years I felt like I was doing something that really interested me. But, of course, it was impossible to avoid talking to the parents. Of course, they didn't keep track of my finances, but when my mother found out that I had quit my job, her reaction was predictable: panic. "Are you crazy?" she exclaimed when I came to dinner with them. "You studied so much, got a good job, and now you just quit? For the sake of some kind of investment?" Dad silently put down his fork and looked at me intently, as if trying to figure out if I was joking or being serious. Sarah was sitting across from me, idly picking at her phone, but I noticed her smirk out of the corner of her lips, clearly enjoying the fact that I was now the main topic of the family drama. "Mom, I know what I'm doing." I tried to keep my voice calm, but my stomach was churning with irritation. "I earn more than I earned in the company. It's my choice." "More? What is it?" she asked incredulously. "How much is that?" I named the amount. She blinked, frowned in disbelief, and exchanged glances with her father. "It's temporary," she said. "It's just luck, Ruby. You're lucky, but what happens when the market changes? When will you make a mistake?" I sighed. Of course, they couldn't understand. They always lived by the rules: school, university, job, pension. Stability was the most important thing for them, and now I was breaking that pattern. "I know how to manage risks," I said firmly. "I've been learning this. I know what I'm doing." "Oh, Ruby," Mom shook her head, leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes, as if she felt unwell. "Why can't you just be like everyone else?" This phrase touched me more deeply than I expected. Be like everyone else? I spent my whole life trying to earn their attention, to do everything right, to be a good daughter, but has that brought me anything other than a constant sense of invisibility? "Because I don't want to be like everyone else," I replied, lifting my head. "I want to be myself." I finally found a house that I really liked, spacious, with huge floor-to-ceiling windows flooding the rooms with soft morning light, with a kitchen where I wanted to spend time, and not just warm up semi-finished products in the microwave, and with a cozy terrace where I already imagined myself with a cup of coffee on a lazy Sunday morning. It was in a nice neighborhood, quiet enough to enjoy the peace, but at the same time within walking distance of the best cafes and shops where I could afford anything, even if my parents still thought I was barely making ends meet. The deal went through quickly, and I bought a house without a mortgage because I could afford it, because I had money that none of them even knew about. When I received the keys and crossed the threshold of my own house for the first time, I was overcome with a sense of triumph. Here it is, my independence, my success, my space, where no one will belittle my achievements or reduce them to amounts that can be spent on Sarah's next whim. I walked through the empty rooms for a long time, touching the walls, imagining what the furniture would be like, where I would put the bookshelves, how I would light candles in the evening and listen to my favorite music. I didn't tell my parents about the purchase right away, not because I was hiding it, but because I just didn't see the point. They wouldn't have understood anyway. They would have reduced everything to chance, luck anyway, or worse, they would have thought that now they had another resource to satisfy Sarah's desires. But one day, after another family dinner, when Mom complained about the high cost of living again, and Sarah casually mentioned that she urgently needed a new laptop for studying. I just took an envelope with my new address out of my bag and put it on the table. "What's that?" Dad asked, raising his eyebrows, while Mom was already reaching for her glasses. "This is my new address," I replied calmly. "I bought a house." There was silence in the room, broken only by the soft clatter of a fork, which my mother dropped. She looked at me with an expression as if I had just announced that I was marrying an alien. "A house?" she finally managed. "You bought a house?" "Yes," I nodded. "Without a mortgage?" "Completely." Sarah snorted. "Oh, well, it's probably some kind of shack," she muttered, picking at the food on her plate. "4 bedrooms, 2 floors, a terrace and a garden," I clarified, looking directly into her eyes. Mom remained silent, and so did Dad. It seemed like they just didn't know what to say, couldn't wrap their heads around the fact that their girl who lives in a rented apartment and probably eats instant noodles, suddenly turned out to be someone who could buy a house they couldn't afford. "But how?" my mother finally asked. I shrugged my shoulders. "Investments. That is. Is this not a joke?" My father took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "You really are. Ruby, you're not involved in anything illegal, are you?" I laughed loudly, sincerely, for the first time in a long time. "No, Dad, I'm not a drug lord. I just worked hard, analyzed the market, invested money wisely and didn't spend it on nonsense." Mom opened her mouth, but Sarah interrupted her, lazily leaning back in her chair. "Well, since you have a house now, maybe I can stay with you? The dormitories at the university are terrible, and renting in the center is a robbery." I chuckled. "Sure." Of course, she immediately decided that since I had something, she also owed it. "No," I replied, just as calmly. "What?" Her face contorted with indignation. "Why?" I put down my fork, folded my hands on the table, and looked at her for a long moment. "Because this is my home. And I don't have to answer to anyone." Mom sighed loudly. "Ruby, but Sarah is your sister." "Yes, and that's why I know how it will end. I have money, I have a house, but that doesn't mean I'm your bank or your hotel. I do not have to sacrifice my life for you, as I have done for all previous years." There was a deathly silence. Sarah blushed and jumped up from her chair, muttering something about ingratitude. Mom and Dad looked at each other, as if not understanding how to react. But I didn't care. This is the first time I've said out loud what I've been thinking for years. And it felt damn good. The parents were in a panic. I knew it, even if they didn't admit it to me directly. Every time I came to Saturday dinners, I noticed more and more anxious wrinkles on my father's forehead, heard my mother sigh more and more often as she ran her finger over the bills left on the kitchen table, and, of course, saw Sarah diligently pretending that she had everything under control, but her fingers they nervously clutched their fork whenever a conversation about work came up. "I'm just looking for suitable options," she said lazily, looking around the room with an indifferent gaze, as if she didn't care at all about the situation. "I'm not going to settle down anywhere." In fact, she sent resumes right and left, but despite her diploma, despite all the money invested in her education, despite the endless conversations of her parents that Sarah was our winner, the market was in no hurry to lay the red carpet in front of her. Companies were looking not so much for the big name of the university and their diploma, but for real skills, the ability to solve problems, work in a team, and cope with crises. And then it turned out that Sarah, accustomed to the fact that the world revolved around her, simply did not know how to do it. Meanwhile, the loans were accumulating. For the first few months, my parents managed using my transfers, but then the monthly payments increased, the interest rates suddenly jumped, and one day, when I looked into the kitchen before dinner, I saw Mom and Dad arguing in a whisper. "We can't just take out another loan, John." Mom sounded tired, leaning her palms on the table. They won't approve of anything anymore, with such a debt. What do you suggest? His father ran a hand over his face. Sarah can't stay without support. She's just starting her journey. I stood in the doorway, silently watching the scene. I was overcome by a familiar wave of fatigue, the same one that always came when it came to Sarah and her endless privileges. Everything went according to a familiar scenario. At first they put everything into it, hoping that it would lead to great success. Then it turned out that expectations did not match reality, and eventually they began to look for a way to shift responsibility. And I knew who it was. "Ruby, dear," Mom began at dinner, her voice soft as velvet and her smile a little strained. "You know how difficult it is for young people right now. The job market is so unstable, and Sarah is trying so hard." I continued to cut the meat without looking up, but everything was already boiling inside me. "Maybe," she continued, "you could increase the amount you're sending us a little. Just a couple thousand a month, just to cover the loans for a while until Sarah gets back on her feet." "No," I said, not letting her finish. There was silence. "What do you mean, no?" Dad frowned. "That means no." I put down my fork and for the first time in a long time looked at them both directly, without fear, without guilt, without the usual desire to please. "I've been helping enough. I paid your bills, I gave you money when you didn't have enough, I paid for your peace of mind. But Sarah is not my responsibility." Mom blinked, as if she couldn't believe she'd heard that from me. "But, Ruby," she began, but I held up my hand, stopping her. "You spent thousands of dollars on her studies because you believed she would be successful. But she can't do it. And that's not my problem. I was working for myself, I was building my life while you were doing it. She's an adult now. Let her handle it herself. You don't want your sister to be in debt, do you?" My father intervened, irritation appeared in his voice. "Do you want me to pay for your mistakes?" I asked calmly. Sarah abruptly pushed back her chair and stood up. "I knew it," she exclaimed, looking at me from under her brows. "You're just jealous of me. I've always been jealous. It pisses you off that I was loved more." I looked at her and slowly, with surprising calmness, I shook my head. "No, Sarah," I said softly, but every word was like a stone falling into water. "It pisses me off that you still haven't realized that the world doesn't have to love you." She froze, her lips trembled, but not from resentment, but from anger. "You're pathetic," she said. "Do you think you're better than me just because you're rich? Do you think money makes you important?" "No," I said, but it gave me the opportunity not to sit here and listen to this play. I got up, picked up my bag, and walked out, leaving them behind, leaving all this senseless drama that had been going on for years, leaving Sarah seething with anger, and my parents, who finally realized they couldn't manipulate me anymore. I heard my mom call out to me, but I didn't even turn around. That evening, I was walking down the street and felt a strange, unfamiliar feeling spreading inside. Freedom. The guests began to gather in the late afternoon, filling the house with the noise of conversations, laughter, and the familiar clink of glasses, while Mom nervously darted between the kitchen and the living room, stealthily checking the setting and straightening napkins, as if the fate of dinner depended on their ideal location. I watched this from the sidelines, sipping my wine imperceptibly and mentally convincing myself that this evening would go smoothly, that I would not allow myself to get annoyed, would not argue with Sarah, and would not let my parents drag me back into their endless conversations about her incredible potential. But, of course, it was just an illusion, because as soon as I turned to the table, I heard Sarah's loud voice, deliberately rising above the hum of conversations in order to attract attention to myself. "Well, Ruby, how was your office hard labor?" Her lips curved into a smug smile as she twirled the wine glass in her hands, clearly anticipating my reaction. I calmly put my glass on the table and looked at her. "Which one are you talking about?" I asked, pretending I didn't understand the hint. The one you've been stuck in for years. She waved her hand. Oh, I know, you're probably already the head of the department. Or is he still subordinate to someone who earns 3 times more than you? There was a tense silence in the room. Several people exchanged furtive glances. Someone pretended to be engrossed in looking at his plate, but I saw that everyone was waiting for me to say something in response. I smiled. Actually, I don't have any bosses, Sarah. She blinked, frowned, and then laughed. What? Fired? Her laugh sounded almost relieved. No, I quit on my own. Years ago. She frowned even more, and Mom, who had been trying to look too busy to interfere, finally raised her head. What do you mean? Her voice sounded cautious, as if she wasn't sure if she wanted to hear the answer. I clasped my fingers in front of me, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and a slight sadness rise inside me, not because I regretted anything, but because I understood that now, at this moment, the balance of power would finally change. It means I'm not working for anyone, I said calmly. I'm investing. It's been a long time. And now I have more money than I can spend. I heard one of the guests inhale sharply. My mother slowly lowered her fork onto her plate. My father stared at me intently from under his glasses, and Sarah turned pale. You're kidding, she said, but there was no longer any confidence in her voice. No, I'm not kidding, I took a sip of wine. I just didn't think it necessary to tell you about it. Wait, but Mom hesitated, choosing her words. You're here every month, aren't you? Yes, I transferred the money to you, I nodded, knowing what she meant. Because I could afford it. But if you're so rich, why don't you? Sarah broke off, but I knew what she wanted to say. Why didn't I buy her an apartment? Why didn't I pay off all her debts? Why didn't I make her life as easy as her parents tried to make it all these years? I looked at her and, slightly tilting my head, replied. Because I don't have to. She pursed her lips, and I saw her eyes flash, either from anger or from the fact that she finally realized that her plan was falling apart. Her little game, in which she had always been the main character, was over, and now she had to cope on her own. She batted her eyelashes, then abruptly got up from the table, pushing the chair. I don't have to listen to this. She ran out of the room, slamming the door loudly, and a heavy silence hung in the living room. I slowly inhaled, exhaled, and looked at my parents. It didn't even occur to you to ask how I was doing, did it? I asked calmly. All these years. Mom looked away, but Dad was silent. Well, now you know. I stood up, straightened my dress, picked up my glass and took one last sip. Happy Thanksgiving. I turned around and walked to the door, leaving behind surprised stares, a full plate of turkey, and the feeling that finally, for the first time in my life, I wasn't just at a family dinner. I controlled him. I looked at her, watching how emotions were mixed in her eyes, first shock, then envy, and then something like fear, as if the only stable picture of the world had collapsed in front of her, in which she had always been the one they adored, the one they sacrificed for, the one whose life should take shape. Better than everyone else, just by right of birth. She gripped the edges of a laptop tighter, her fingers white with tension, and I could already imagine her slamming the lid shut, trying to regain control, but instead she just froze, as if lost, as if she suddenly realized that all her ridicule, all her attempts to make me look like a loser now meant nothing. You're kidding, she muttered, but even she knew better. No, I slowly got up from my chair, calmly and confidently, although everything inside me was boiling, not from anger, no, more from fatigue, because I had to justify myself again for having managed to get out of the cage into which I was trapped. It's true. Mom, who had been frozen with a napkin in her hand, finally spoke up. Ruby. There was something new in her gaze, something I hadn't seen before, a mixture of surprise, caution, and a barely concealed feeling of pride? I wasn't sure. How long ago? My father asked, frowning, although his voice didn't sound angry, but rather confused. A long time ago, I shrugged. You just never asked. But why didn't you tell us? Mom put her napkin on the table, her fingers trembling. I laughed, and it was a real laugh, not nervous, not sarcastic, but just sincere, because the question was so ridiculous, so overdue. And why? I looked around the table, saw the faces of relatives who clearly did not know where to put themselves, because the conversation suddenly took a completely different turn. To hear again that Sarah is having a hard time? To become invisible again? So that you can explain to me once again why her needs are more important than mine? But you helped anyway, my father muttered. You transferred money to us. Because I could, I replied. But I've never done it for the sake of recognition. I looked at Sarah, still clutching her laptop, and her face was distorted with emotion. Now it was no longer just shock, it was not just envy. It was a real, burning, uncontrollable rage. It's not fair, she said through clenched teeth. What's unfair? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. That's it. Her voice broke, and she abruptly put the laptop down on the table, so that the screen swayed. It's not fair that you just got rich like that, but I didn't. Sarah, Mom shook her head, but she wasn't listening. I studied at the best university, she continued, looking directly at me, her eyes glittering as if she were on the verge of tears, but I knew it wasn't from pain, it was from being forced to face reality for the first time in her life. I tried, I did everything I had to do, and you didn't even try to deserve it. I chuckled. Didn't try? I repeated, feeling a cold, heavy irritation boil up inside me. I was plowing. I studied when you were sitting at dinners and discussing you. I was working while you were complaining that you didn't get enough attention. I invested money when you spent it on nonsense. Are you saying that I didn't do anything about it? She bit her lip, her chest heaving with heavy breathing. I should have been successful, not you, she said finally, softly, almost whispering. I shook my head. Were you supposed to be successful? Why? Because that's what your parents decided? Because you're used to having everything handed to you on a platter? Because you've always been the center of attention? I stepped closer, looking into her eyes. In this world, it doesn't matter who owes what. It's important who's willing to work for it. She turned away, clenched her fists, and a tense silence hung in the room again, in which you could hear water dripping softly from the faucet in the sink, as someone carefully moved a fork on a plate, as Grandma, who was sitting closest to me, suddenly sighed softly. Well, came my uncle's voice, which seemed to want to defuse the situation. This is an unexpected twist. Mom frowned, looked at him, then back at me. So you're rich now? I nodded. So you could buy yourself a better house? I nodded again. So you could not work at all? I could, I shrugged. But I like to work. She blinked as if trying to process that answer, then looked at her father, then back at Sarah, who was still standing with her hands clenched into fists. You're going to help the family anyway, aren't you? I exhaled slowly. I helped, Mom, I said, trying to keep my voice level. Long enough. But now that you can. No, I interrupted her. She froze. What? I said no. I'm not giving you money anymore. Not to you, not to Dad, not to Sarah. Her face contorted. But we're your family. Exactly, I nodded. And the family should not perceive me as a purse. There was a pause. I looked at everyone sitting at the table, at the faces of relatives who for the first time did not know what to say, at my mother, who was horrified that her usual order of things was collapsing, at my father, who looked tired rather than angry, and at Sarah, who... Sarah just stared at nothing. I suddenly realized that all this time she had been living with the idea that sooner or later everything would fall into place, that somehow, miraculously, the money would come to her on its own, that success would fall into her hands, because he just had to be hers. But now she understood the truth. And she had nothing to say. I picked up my glass, took one last sip, and put it back on the table. "Thanks for dinner," I said, turning around and heading for the exit. No one tried to stop me this time. I threw the phone on the couch, not even bothering to look at the screen, and slowly sank into an armchair, closing my eyes and allowing myself to sink into silence for a moment. It was deafening, but not oppressive, not the kind that comes after an argument, when everything inside is shaking with tension, but the kind that comes after a long-awaited release. I could still hear my mother's screams, my father's trembling voice, Sarah's tears, and I knew that if I unlocked my phone now, I would see dozens of messages full of resentment, accusations, and maybe even threats. But I didn't want to read them. I didn't feel guilty anymore. I ran my hand over my face, inhaled slowly, as if trying to completely shake off the weight of years spent in the shadows, in a constant struggle for attention, for recognition, for the right to be heard, and suddenly I was overcome by laughter, quiet, at first almost soundless, but then it got louder until I burst into real laughter. The one that comes not from having fun, but from realizing the absurdity of the situation. They really thought they had a right to me. They really believed that I was obligated not just to help, but to pay them for their mistakes, to pay for their decisions, their blind faith that Sarah was the only one who deserved a better life, and that I should meekly accept my supporting role. But now it was different. I finally said no. And it was perfect. I slowly got up and went to the window, looking out at the night city, at the twinkling lights, at the cars speeding through the streets, and felt a calmness spreading inside me. I didn't know anyone anything. I didn't have to save my parents from their debts. I didn't have to provide for my sister, who looked down on me all her life. I did it. I've built my life. And now she belonged only to me. The phone vibrated again. I turned and looked at him, but I didn't even move. Let them call. Let them write. Let them continue to waste their energy trying to manipulate me. I won't let them anymore. And at that moment, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I felt truly free. I was sitting on the floor in my living room, my bare feet touching the cold parquet, holding a phone in my hands that no longer vibrated from endless calls, was no longer bursting with messages, was no longer a link between me and those who for many years saw in me only a convenient resource. I looked at my laptop screen, where photos of houses in sunny California, rainy Seattle, and bustling New York flashed by, and I felt a strange but pleasant feeling spreading inside me, a feeling of a clean slate, a new beginning, the opportunity to finally belong to myself. I remembered how I once dreamed that one day my family would notice me, see in me more than just a background for Sarah's success, more than a convenient sponsor to pay the bills, but now this dream seemed alien, distant, naive to me. They knew I existed. They just didn't consider me important until I turned out to be the only person who could solve their problems. And when I refused, they showed their true colors. I no longer felt pain, anger, or disappointment. Just relief. The next day, I woke up earlier than usual, feeling an unusual lightness in the air, as if something invisible that had been weighing on me for many years had finally disappeared. I made coffee, turned on some music, sat down at my laptop, and continued browsing through real estate listings. Not hurrying, not looking back, not doubting. I was thinking that family isn't always about those who are related to you by blood. Sometimes a family is people who see you, hear you, respect you, and not those who demand that you sacrifice yourself for their convenience. I knew that my departure would not change them. They will continue to complain, they will continue to accuse me, they will continue to tell everyone what a heartless and ungrateful daughter I am. Maybe Sarah will find someone else to take care of her expenses. Maybe Mom will find a new drama to be the center of attention. Maybe Dad will finally admit that not everything in life can be controlled. Or maybe nothing will change. But it didn't matter anymore. Because I was leaving. Because I was no longer their victim. Because now my life belonged only to me.